They were convinced their fighter was invincible. The Mitsubishi A6M, the Zero, had proven itself over China and swept Allied air forces from the skies across the Pacific. Japanese naval pilots, the best in the world, believed their fighter represented the pinnacle of aerial design, a flawless weapon. They had crushed every enemy they encountered. Their combination of extreme range and unmatched maneuverability seemed supernatural. They were the new masters of the sky, the airborne samurai of the empire. They were wrong. The story of how they discovered this begins not with defeat but with overwhelming confidence. The Zero was no accident of design. It was the product of a demanding 1937 specification from the Imperial Japanese Navy. They needed a new carrier-based fighter, the 12-Shi, to replace the aging A5M. The requirements they issued were considered impossible by almost every other aircraft manufacturer. The Navy demanded a top speed of 500 kilometers per hour. They demanded a climb rate to 3,000 meters in under 3.5 minutes. Most dauntingly, they demanded an operational range of 8 hours, a distance that would allow them to escort bombers deep into China from carriers or distant bases. The Nakajima Aircraft Company dropped out, declaring the specifications impossible to meet. Only Mitsubishi Heavy Industries remained. The task fell to their chief designer, Jiro Horikoshi. He understood that meeting these demands would require a radical departure from conventional design, forcing him to make brutal compromises. Horikoshi knew that to achieve the required speed and range, the aircraft must be impossibly light. Every single component was re-evaluated. His team developed a new aluminum alloy, Extra Super Duralumin, which was lighter and stronger than standard alloys, but also more brittle and difficult to work with. But material science alone was not enough. To meet the weight requirements, Horikoshi had to make a fateful decision. He would completely omit armor plating for the pilot. He would also eliminate the self-sealing fuel tanks that were becoming standard in Western aircraft, a choice that saved hundreds of pounds. This decision traded survivability directly for performance. The fuel tanks were integral to the wing structure, maximizing capacity but leaving them completely exposed to enemy fire. The pilot was protected by only thin aluminum skin. It was a gamble that Horikoshi and the Navy were willing to take. The prototype first flew in April 1939. It was powered by a 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai radial engine, producing 940 horsepower. The aircraft, now designated A6M2, met or exceeded every single one of the Navy's impossible requirements. It was a true masterpiece of lightweight aeronautical engineering. The Zero was rushed into service and first saw combat over China in September 1940. On September 13th, 13 A6M2s escorting bombers encountered 27 Soviet-made Chinese fighters. In the engagement that followed, all 27 Chinese aircraft were shot down without a single Japanese loss. The Zero shock had begun. When the Pacific War began on December 7, 1941, the Zero was the tip of the spear. At Pearl Harbor, they swept aside American resistance, strafing airfields and protecting the bombers. The Americans, flying obsolete P-40 Warhawks and P-36, were stunned by the new fighter's agility. In the Philippines, the story was the same. Zeros decimated the American Far East Air Force, destroying them on the ground and in the air. In Malaya and Singapore, they outflew the British Hawker Hurricanes. The Hurricane was a modern fighter, but it simply could not turn with the Zero. Allied pilots were in a state of disbelief. They reported encountering an enemy fighter that could climb like a rocket and turn on a dime. Its range seemed limitless, allowing it to appear where no fighter was expected. It seemed indestructible because few pilots could even get a shot. The Zero's armament was also formidable for 1941. It carried two 7.7-meter machine guns in the fuselage and, more importantly, two powerful 20mm cannons in the wings. These cannons could shred an Allied fighter with just a few hits, while the Zero's agility made it an almost impossible target. This overwhelming success bred a dangerous confidence, bordering on arrogance. Japanese naval pilots, already imbued with a strong sense of Bushido, believed they were invincible. They believed their aircraft was technically superior in every way, and that their skill alone could overcome any challenge. Allied intelligence was desperate to understand the new weapon. They had only wreckage and the terrified reports of surviving pilots. Claire Chennault of the Flying Tigers in China had compiled a detailed report on its tactics and weaknesses, but his report was largely ignored by Washington. Chennault warned that the Zero had a slow roll rate and could not perform well in a high-speed dive. He urged his pilots to never dogfight, but to use boom and zoom tactics. But to confirm these theories, the Allies needed an intact example. Their chance came in June 1942. On June 4, 1942, during the attack on Dutch Harbor, Alaska, a flight of Zeros from the carrier Ryujo attacked the base. One of them was piloted by 19-year-old Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga. During a strafing run, his A6M2 was hit by .50 caliber ground fire. The bullets ruptured his oil line. It was not a fatal hit for a protected plane, but on the unprotected Zero, it was a death sentence. Koga knew his engine would eventually seize. He flew to the nearby Akutan Island, which was designated for emergency landings, to await submarine pickup. He aimed for what looked like a flat, grassy field. This field was actually soft, wet muskeg. As the Zero touched down, its landing gear dug into the mud. The aircraft flipped over onto its back, instantly killing Koga from a broken neck. His wingman left, unable to destroy the plane. For 5 weeks, the pristine A6M2 Model 21 lay upside down in the mud, hidden from view. On July 10th, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina patrol plane spotted the wreckage. The crew, led by Lieutenant William Bill Tease, landed and understood the impossible value of what they had found. This was not wreckage. It was a complete, salvageable brand new Zero. The recovery operation was immediate and top secret. The aircraft was carefully extracted from the bog, disassembled, and shipped to Naval Air Station North Island, San Diego. It was a monumental intelligence windfall. There, the aircraft was meticulously repaired and repainted with American markings. By September 1942, the Akutan Zero was flying again. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders climbed into the cockpit. He was the first American to truly fly the Legend, and he was about to discover all its secrets. The first flights confirmed what pilots had reported, its incredible maneuverability. At speeds below 200 knots, it could outturn every fighter the Allies had, including the Spitfire. Its climb rate was astonishing, but the test pilots also confirmed every weakness Chennault had warned about. The Zero's controls became extremely heavy at high speeds, well over 220 knots. Its roll rate was poor, especially to the right, and most critically, it could not handle a high-speed dive. The carburetor would flood, and the engine would quit in a negative G maneuver. The technical analysis was just as revealing. Engineers confirmed the complete lack of armor around the pilot or engine. They found the large, unprotected fuel tanks in the wings. They noted the lightweight, brittle duralumin skin that could be easily pierced by .50 caliber rounds. The invincible fighter was a tinderbox. The Akutan Zero was then flown to Naval Air Station Anacostia. Here, it was put in mock dogfights against the Navy's current frontline fighters, the F-4F Wildcat, the P-40, and the P-38. The results were compiled into a new tactical manual that would be sent to every pilot in the Pacific. The new doctrine was simple and absolute. Do not dogfight the Zero. Do not try to turn with it. Do not try to outclimb it. Instead, you must exploit its weaknesses. Initiate combat with a high-speed dive. Use your superior speed and roll rate to get a shot and then dive away. If a Zero gets on your tail, do not try to outturn it. Push the stick forward into a dive. The Zero cannot follow, or if you have a wingman, execute the new tactic developed by Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch, the Thatch Weave. The Thatch Weave was a defensive maneuver where two Allied fighters would fly side by side. When a Zero attacked one, they would turn towards each other. The Zero, forced to follow its target, would fly directly into the sights of the other fighter. It was a perfect, deadly trap. The Akutan Zero's intelligence was a turning point. It armed Allied pilots with knowledge, the one weapon they had lacked. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. They still needed a new machine, a fighter designed specifically to kill the Zero by exploiting these newly discovered flaws. That fighter was already in development. Grumman Aircraft, which had built the rugged F-4F Wildcat, was working on its replacement. The Grumman engineers had famously been allowed to inspect the Akutan Zero. They designed their new plane, the F-6F Hellcat, to be the ultimate Zero killer. The Hellcat was the philosophical opposite of the Zero. It was not light. It was a 12,000-pound beast. It was not agile in a slow-speed turn, but it was fast, rugged, and heavily armed. It featured 212 pounds of cockpit armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. It was designed to do everything the Zero could not. It could dive at high speed. It had a superior roll rate. It could absorb massive amounts of damage and still bring its pilot home. It was an industrial age weapon, designed for a war of attrition, not a lightweight duelist. The stage was set for a new kind of air war. The Japanese, still confident in their invincible Zero, were unaware that their greatest weapon had been completely compromised. The Americans were now armed with both the tactics and the technology to dismantle the Zero's reputation. The ultimate test came in June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy, attempting to stop the American invasion of Saipan, launched Operation Ago. It was a massive carrier strike intended to annihilate the American fleet. They were confident their Zeros would protect them. On June 19, 1944, the Japanese launched 4 massive raids. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft, including Zeros and torpedo bombers, flew toward the American fleet. But the Americans were waiting. They had radar, which detected the incoming raids over 100 miles away, removing the element of surprise, and they had the F-6F Hellcat. Squadrons of Hellcats from Task Force 58 climbed to intercept. This was the first large-scale engagement between the veteran Zero and the new Hellcat. The Japanese pilots expected another easy victory, another 1941-style turkey shoot, just like in the Philippines. Instead, they flew into a buzzsaw. The Hellcat pilots did exactly what the Akutan Zero tests had taught them. They refused to dogfight. They used their superior speed and altitude to dive on the Japanese formations, make high-speed firing passes, and then climb away to safety. The Hellcats, armed with 650 caliber machine guns, ripped the unprotected Zeros to shreds. The Zeros, when hit, did not limp home. They exploded. The lack of armor and self-sealing tanks, the very design choice that gave them their agility, now guaranteed their destruction. Japanese pilots who dove to escape the Hellcats found their engines cutting out from fuel starvation. American pilots who were attacked used the thatch weave, trapping the overconfident Zero pilots. It was a one-sided slaughter. The sky was filled with burning Japanese aircraft. By the end of the day, over 300 Japanese carrier aircraft had been shot down. The Americans lost only 29 planes. American pilots, marveling at the ease of the battle, nicknamed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Zero's reign as King of the Sky was over, destroyed in a single afternoon. This battle was not just a tactical victory. It was the complete annihilation of Japanese naval aviation. The Japanese Navy had lost its best-trained, most experienced pilots, the veterans of Pearl Harbor and the early victories. They were irreplaceable. The industrial and training gap was too large. The Zero's fundamental design flaw, the sacrifice of protection for performance, had been catastrophically exposed. What had been a brilliant advantage in 1941 became a fatal liability by 1944. When faced with an enemy that had superior technology, superior tactics, and overwhelming numbers, the Japanese had designed a Kesson weapon, a decisive battle winner. It was a duelist's rapier. The Americans had designed an industrial weapon, a butcher's cleaver. In the brutal war of attrition that defined the Pacific conflict, the cleaver had won. The Zero was now fatally obsolete. Japanese engineers had tried desperately to update the Zero. The A6M5, used at the Marianas, had a faster roll rate and dive speed, but it still lacked armor and self-sealing tanks. The fundamental philosophy had not changed, because Japan's industrial base could not support the added weight. The A6M was a product of Japan's specific strategic needs in the 1930s, a long-range fighter that could operate over vast ocean expanses and deep into China. No other nation needed this, so no other nation built it. It was a perfect solution for a problem only they had. This created a strategic blind spot. The Japanese Navy became so focused on the A6M's success that they failed to develop an adequate replacement in time. By the time the Hellcat and Corsair appeared, Japan had nothing that could compete on equal terms. The production numbers tell the rest of the story. Japan produced approximately 10,900 Zeros of all variants during the entire war. The Allies produced over 12,200 F6F Hellcats in just 2 years. They also produced over 12,500 F4U Corsairs and 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts. The industrial disparity was overwhelming. The United States was not just building better fighters, it was building them at a rate Japan could not even comprehend. The turkey shoot was not just a victory of tactics, it was a victory of the assembly line in factories back home. The Hellcat, the Zero's executioner, was so effective that it achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft, the highest of any Allied fighter in the war. It was a machine built to absorb damage and bring its pilot home, while the Zero was a machine built to perform. In the final year of the war, the Zero's role devolved from a proud fighter to a tragic one. With its long range and ability to carry a single 250 kg bomb, it became the primary aircraft used for kamikaze attacks. Its lightweight, unprotected frame made it an ideal delivery vehicle. The same design feature that made it a brilliant fighter in 1941, its vulnerability and lightweight, made it a disposable suicide weapon in 1945. The pilots who had once believed themselves invincible were now ordered to die in a final, desperate act to protect the homeland. The Zero story is a stark lesson in military design. It proves that a weapon optimized for one set of conditions can be fatally flawed in another. Its early success was not just due to its design, but due to the context of unprepared enemies and poor Allied tactics. Once that context changed, once the enemy analyzed the flaw and mass-produced a counter, the weapon became a liability. The Zero's crews paid the price for that design gamble. They were sent to fight a 1944 war of attrition with a 1937 design built for duels. When American engineers at North Island first examined the Akutan Zero, they were not just analyzing an enemy aircraft. They were witnessing the physical manifestation of a design philosophy that prioritized performance above pilot survival. A philosophy that would cost thousands of Japan's best pilots their lives. The unprotected fuel tanks and lack of armor were not an oversight. They were a deliberate choice. Jiro Horikoshi had built exactly what the Navy demanded, a long-range, agile fighter. The Navy had demanded performance. He delivered performance, but in doing so sealed its fate. The Zero's legacy is that of a legend, but also a cautionary tale. It shows that no weapon is invincible. It shows that sacrificing protection for performance is a gamble that eventually the enemy will call. For the Zero, that call came from the 50 caliber guns of the Hellcat. The aftermath of the Marianas turkey shoot was devastating for Japan. The loss of over 300 carrier aircraft and, more critically, their experienced pilots was a blow from which their naval air arm would never recover. The Zero's reputation for invincibility was shattered among its own pilots. For the American pilots, the battle was a revelation. The new Hellcats, combined with the tactics derived from the Akutan Zero, had proven overwhelmingly effective. They now knew they were superior. Tiger phobia in Europe was replaced by zero fever in the Pacific, an eagerness to hunt them. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was profound. They had been trained to believe in their spiritual and technical superiority. Now they were facing an enemy that was not only numerous, but technically superior in key areas. Their lightweight fighters were exploding from short bursts of 50 caliber fire. Many Japanese veterans in post-war interviews described a feeling of helplessness. They would engage a Hellcat, only to watch it dive away at speeds their Zeros could not match. Or they would be attacked from above by an enemy they never saw, their plane disintegrating before they could react. Intelligence officers interrogating captured Japanese pilots noted their shock at American industrial might. They couldn't comprehend how the US could field so many advanced fighters. They also expressed amazement at the ruggedness of American aircraft, which could absorb dozens of 20mm hits and still fly. The Zero's 20mm cannons, so feared in 1941, had a low muzzle velocity and a slow rate of fire. This made hitting a fast-moving, diving Hellcat extremely difficult. In contrast, the 650 caliber machine guns on the Hellcat provided a dense, high-velocity stream of fire. This disparity in firepower was a direct result of different design philosophies. The Japanese favored the one-shot kill potential of a cannon shell. The Americans favored the buzzsaw effect of multiple heavy machine guns, overwhelming a target with a high volume of penetrating rounds. The American 50 caliber M2 Browning, firing armor-piercing incendiary API rounds, was the perfect weapon against the Zero. The API rounds didn't just punch holes, they ignited the unprotected fuel tanks. The Zero's lightweight duralumin skin offered zero protection, turning the plane into an inferno. Japanese engineers had understood this vulnerability. The A6M3 and later the A6M5 attempted to address the flaws. They added fire suppression systems for the fuel tanks, but these were crude CO2-based systems, not true self-sealing rubber bladders. They were largely ineffective against incendiary ammunition. They also added small amounts of armor plate for the pilot in later models. But Japan's industry, strained by war and lacking raw materials, could not afford the weight penalty. Adding full armor and self-sealing tanks would have negated the Zero's performance advantage, turning it into a mediocre, underpowered fighter. Japan's industrial capacity simply could not produce the more powerful engines needed to compensate for this added weight. While the US was mass-producing 2,000 horsepower engines like the Pratt & Whitney R2800, Japan was still struggling to refine its 1,100 horsepower Sakai engine. The US war machine was operating on an entirely different scale. The Volt F4U Corsair, another Zero killer, was also being produced by the thousands. Like the Hellcat, it was large, heavily armed, and incredibly fast. It was another industrial-age weapon the Zero simply could not counter. The production statistics are staggering. For every one A6M Zero Japan built, the United States built more than 12 F6F Hellcats, F4U Corsairs, and P-47 Thunderbolts combined. This was not a fair fight. It was an industrial avalanche that buried the Japanese war effort under a mountain of steel. The US Navy's approach to pilot training was also a key factor. The US had a massive 2-year training pipeline that produced thousands of well-trained, competent pilots. If a pilot was lost, another was ready. This system valued the pilot as a precious, replaceable asset. Japan's training program was brutally selective and focused on creating a small number of elite super pilots. This system produced the brilliant aces of 1941, but it was slow and inflexible. When these aces were killed, there was no one to replace them. The experience gap became a chasm. By late 1944, new Japanese pilots were being sent into combat with less than 100 hours of flight time. They were flying obsolete Zeros against thousands of American veterans in Hellcats who often had over 500 hours. The result was a slaughter. This desperation led directly to the kamikaze strategy. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese air supremacy, became a guided missile. Its long range and bomb-carrying capacity made it suitable, but its vulnerability ensured it was a one-way mission. The invincible fighter became a disposable bomb. The philosophy of Bushido, or spirit over matter, had underpinned the Zero's design. The Navy believed that a superior pilot in a more agile, unarmored plane could defeat a lesser pilot in a heavier, armored one. The Marianas Turkey shoot proved this philosophy catastrophically wrong. In modern industrial warfare, matter was what mattered. Logistics, production numbers, and rugged survivable designs were the keys to victory. The American F6F Hellcat was the perfect embodiment of this. It was designed to be good enough, easy to mass-produce, and above all to bring its pilot home. Grumman Aircraft, the builder of the Hellcat, was nicknamed the Iron Works. Their planes were famously tough. Pilots told stories of landing Hellcats with entire cylinders shot off the engine, or with wings that looked like Swiss cheese. This survivability gave American pilots incredible confidence. When American engineers and test pilots at Anacostia finished their evaluation of the Akutan Zero, their final report was a damning indictment. They praised its agility and climb rate, but condemned its structural weakness, its poor dive performance, and its complete lack of protection for the pilot. They noted that the wing, so light and efficient, would shear off in a high-speed dive. They found the controls were crude, using simple push rods, while American fighters were using hydraulic systems. The radio equipment was poor, making coordinated squadron tactics nearly impossible for the Japanese. The cockpit was cramped, with poor visibility to the rear, a fatal flaw in a dogfight. The Hellcat, by contrast, had a bubble canopy that gave its pilot excellent all-around vision. The Americans had identified every single flaw and systematically built a machine to exploit it. The Akutan Zero itself, serial number 4593, was destroyed in a ground accident in 1945. But its mission was complete. It had given the Allies the blueprint for the Zero's destruction. It had turned the tide of the air war as much as any single battle. The story of the Zero is not one of a bad aircraft. It was a brilliant aircraft, perhaps the best carrier fighter in the world in 1941. Its story is one of a weapon that was perfectly adapted for a war that ended in 1942, but fatally unsuited for the war that began in 1943. Japan's initial victories were based on a short, decisive war plan. They never intended to fight a multi-year war of attrition against the world's largest industrial power. The Zero, a short war weapon, was a reflection of this flawed strategic assumption. When the war of attrition began, the Zero's design philosophy, performance at any cost, became a death sentence. The Japanese Navy had gambled that their pilots' skill would be their armor. It was a gamble they lost, and they lost it in the skies over the Marianas. For the American forces, the lessons were clear. Technology and tactics were linked. Understanding the enemy's equipment was the key to defeating it. And in a global conflict, the nation with the most resilient, mass-produced, and survivable weapons would win. The Hellcat was that weapon. The Zero's legacy, therefore, is a tragic one. It was a beautiful, deadly duelist in an age of industrial brawlers. It represented the peak of one type of aeronautical design, but also the dead end of a military philosophy that valued spirit over steel. When those 50-caliber rounds from the ground crew at Dutch Harbor hit Koga's Zero, they set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the death of Japanese naval aviation. The discovery of that one plane, intact in the mud, was a turning point. It proved that no weapon is invincible. It showed that every design has a weakness, a flaw that can be exploited. For the Zero, that flaw was its core identity, its lightness. The very thing that made it great also made it fragile. For Japanese pilots, the realization that their invincible fighter was a tinderbox, vulnerable to even machine gun fire, was a psychological blow. It was the moment they understood that the war was not just unwinnable, but that their leaders had sent them to fight it in flawed machines. The US Navy, by contrast, built an ecosystem of victory: radar for detection, Hellcats for interception, and a training program that supplied an endless stream of competent pilots. They fought a systems-based war, while Japan was still fighting a war of individual duels. The final analysis from Aberdeen Proving Ground on captured Zeros echoed the findings from the Akutan plane. Structurally weak, poor protection, vulnerable to fire. The engineers were not just describing an aircraft, they were describing a failed strategy, one that had cost an empire. The Zero story is a stark reminder that military technology does not exist in a vacuum. It is a product of a nation's industry, its resources, and its core beliefs. The Zero was the perfect expression of 1930s Japan. The Hellcat was the perfect expression of 1940s America. The A6M-0 served from the first day of the war to the last. It achieved some of the most stunning victories in the history of air power, but its ultimate legacy is one of catastrophic failure, a lesson written in fire across the skies of the Pacific. It shows that a weapon's early success, when facing unprepared foes, can blind a nation to its fundamental flaws. The Japanese Navy fell in love with the Zero and refused to see its weaknesses until it was far too late, until the sky was full of Hellcats. The American pilots who flew against it in 1944 did not fear it. They respected its turning ability, but they knew with absolute certainty how to kill it. That knowledge was the true victory, a victory that began not in a factory, but in a muddy swamp on Akutan Island. The story of the A6M-0 is a story of how a perfect weapon becomes a perfect target. It is a story of how a single, captured machine can change the course of a war by revealing the fatal compromise at the heart of its design. The Japanese pilots believed their agility would protect them. They believed their spirit was their armor. The 50 caliber machine gun, firing incendiary rounds into unprotected fuel tanks, proved that in modern war, spirit is not enough. Steel and logistics are what decide the victor. The Zero was a weapon that asked its pilots to be perfect. The Hellcat was a weapon that allowed its pilots to make mistakes, to take hits, and to return home to fight another day. In the end, the nation that valued its pilots' survival built the air force that won the war. The Invincible fighter was, in fact, one of the most vulnerable aircraft of the entire war. Its pilots were sent to their deaths by a design philosophy that prioritized a few seconds of turn rate over the ability to survive a single bullet. This fatal trade-off, made by Jiro Horikoshi in 1937 to meet an impossible demand, would be paid for in blood by thousands of Japan's best pilots. It was a compromise that gave them 2 years of glory, followed by 3 years of slaughter. The U.S. industrial machine, by comparison, was a marvel of the modern world. Factories like Grumman's in Bethpage, New York, were churning out Hellcats at a peak rate of 600 per month. That was more fighters in 2 months than Japan's entire carrier-based force in 1944. These factories were staffed by a new army of workers, including thousands of women, Rosie the Riveters, who built the complex engines and riveted the heavy armor. This mobilization of the entire civilian population was something Japan's economy could not match. So while the Japanese Navy was still relying on the Zero, a 1939 design, the U.S. Navy had already replaced its frontline fighter, the Wildcat, with a superior model, the Hellcat, and was already introducing the next generation, the Corsair. The pace of innovation was relentless. For the Japanese pilot, the war was a terrifying regression. He went from being the hunter to the hunted. His aircraft, once a symbol of pride, became a symbol of his nation's inability to keep pace. Every burning Zero was a testament to that failure. When the war ended, American forces found hundreds of Zeros parked on airfields across Japan. They were being saved for the final kamikaze defense, their role as fighters long since over. They were relics of a forgotten era of invincibility. The examination of these surviving aircraft confirmed what the Akutan Zero had first revealed. They were masterpieces of lightweight construction, but they were not weapons of modern war. They were fragile, underpowered, and by 1945, completely obsolete. The Zero story is the ultimate lesson in military evolution. It proved that a weapon system must adapt or die. The Japanese, locked into their design philosophy and constrained by their industry, could not adapt. Their air force died over the Philippine Sea. The American pilots who fought and won in the Pacific did so with a combination of courage, training, and, most importantly, superior equipment. They flew machines that were designed to win a long, brutal industrial war. The Zero was designed to win a single, decisive battle. That is the fundamental difference. The A6M-0 was a scalpel, designed for a surgical strike. The F-6F Hellcat was a sledgehammer, designed to crush an enemy through brute force. In the total war of the 20th century, the sledgehammer always wins. The invincibility of the Zero was a myth. It was a myth born from early victories against unprepared enemies. When that myth collided with the industrial reality of the United States and the 50 caliber machine gun, it evaporated in a fireball over the Pacific. The crews of the A6M-0, who climbed into their unarmored cockpits, were some of the best-trained pilots in the world. They were sent to die for a design flaw, sacrificed for a few degrees of turn rate by a high command that had misjudged the nature of the war. The lesson from Akutan Island was simple. No weapon is a secret for long. Once captured, once analyzed, its weaknesses become its death warrant. The Akutan Zero signed the death warrant for the entire Japanese Naval Air Force. The Zero was not just defeated by a better fighter, it was defeated by a better system. A system of mass production, of superior training, of rugged design, and of intelligence that turned a single plane, flipped upside down in a bog, into the key to victory. The Zero's story began with total dominance and ended in total annihilation. It is a perfect arc of military tragedy, a testament to what happens when a nation bets its entire strategy on a single, flawed, invincible weapon. The confidence of the Japanese pilots in 1941 was real, but it was based on a false premise. They were not invincible. Their aircraft was not invincible. It was a lightweight duelist, and it was about to fight a war against industrial heavyweights. It never stood a chance.